The town of Millbrook Creek, Kansas, had grown used to the sight of him. Harlan Shepard, standing beneath the old bur oak outside the white clapboard church every single Sunday morning, hat in his weathered hands, listening to hymns he would not go inside to sing. Rain or shine, dust storm or frost, he came and stood at the edge of the churchyard fence, close enough to hear the organ and the voices raised in praise, far enough that no one could rightly say he belonged there. For 3 years he had done this, and for 3 years Annie Carter had watched him from the corner of her eye through the open church window, wondering what kept a man rooted to that same patch of grass, Sunday after Sunday, like a fence post that had simply decided to grow there. It was the spring of 1881 when this particular Sunday came, the one that would change the shape of both their lives, though neither of them knew it yet. The wind came down off the plains carrying the smell of turned earth and new grass, and the bell in the church tower rang out over the rooftops of Millbrook Creek, calling the faithful to worship as it had every week since the church was built a decade before. Harlan Shepard walked from the Double D Ranch, 3 miles distant, his boots raising small clouds of dust on the road, and took his place beneath the oak tree just as he always did, just as he had done since the spring he first arrived in this town with nothing but a bedroll, a rifle, and a grief too heavy to carry through any church door. Harlan had not always been a man who stood outside churches. There had been a time, long before Kansas, long before the Double D Ranch and its foreman Silas Doyle, when Harlan Shepard had walked into a small clapboard church in Missouri every Sunday with his wife Sarah on his arm and their daughter me toddling between them, her small hand wrapped around his finger. He had been young then, barely 20, home from the war with a limp that never fully healed and a heart that had not yet learned what real loss meant. He had married Sarah in that church in the autumn of 1866, had watched me be baptized at that same altar a year later, and had sat in the third pew from the front every week of his life, until the fever came through the county in the summer of 1869. He had been away when it happened, hired to drive a herd of cattle north to the railhead, gone only 6 weeks, but 6 weeks was long enough. He came home to find the house empty and a fresh double grave in the churchyard, his wife and daughter buried together beneath a stone he had not chosen, and a service he had not attended, because the letter telling him had arrived 2 days after they had already been laid in the ground. The preacher who buried them had written him a kind letter, full of scripture and comfort, but Harlan had read only the first line before he folded it and put it away, and he had not set foot inside a church from that day forward. He told himself it was because the God who let a man miss his own wife and daughter's funeral was not a God he cared to sit before. In truth, though he would never have said it aloud, it was because he was afraid that if he walked through those doors again, he would have to feel the whole weight of it all at once, and he did not believe he would survive the feeling. For 9 years he wandered, taking work where he found it, a hand on this ranch, a fence rider on that one, a man who kept to himself and spoke only when spoken to, until he came at last to Millbrook Creek in the spring of 1878 and took a job with Silas Doyle breaking horses and mending fences on the Double D. He was a man other men respected without quite warming to, the sort who could gentle the wildest colt in the corral with nothing but patience and a low voice, but who never joined the other hands at the saloon of an evening, never spoke of where he had come from, and carried himself with a quiet sorrow that the town, in time, simply came to accept as part of who he was. It was on his 3rd Sunday in Millbrook Creek that he first heard her sing. He had been walking past the church on his way back from the mercantile, in no particular hurry, when the sound of a woman's voice rising above the congregation stopped him cold in the middle of the road. It was not a trained voice, not the kind you might hear in a grand cathedral back east, but it was clear and warm and full of something that struck him square in the chest, an echo of every hymn Sarah had ever hummed while she worked, and before he understood what he was doing, he had walked to the fence and stood there listening until the hymn ended. He told himself he would leave then, that he had heard enough, but his feet did not move, and when the next hymn began, he found himself still standing there, hat in his hands, and from the open window of the church, a young woman at the organ turned her head just slightly and saw him. That was Annie Carter, though he did not yet know her name, and she did not know his. She was 22 years old that spring, the only daughter of Reverend Josiah Carter, who had built the church with his own hands and the labor of the town a decade before, and had shepherded its congregation ever since. Annie played the organ and led the singing every Sunday, taught the town's children their letters and sums in the one-room schoolhouse the other 6 days of the week, and had grown so accustomed to the rhythms of Millbrook Creek that she had long ago stopped expecting anything in it to surprise her. The sight of a stranger standing at the fence, listening but not entering, was the first surprising thing to happen in that church in longer than she could remember. She did not think much of it that first Sunday, nor the second. But by the third, when she looked up from the organ keys and saw the same man in the same spot, hat over his heart during the closing hymn, something in her began to wonder. She asked her father about him that evening over supper, and Reverend Carter, who made it his business to know every soul in his parish whether they came inside or not, told her what little he knew. His name was Harlan Shepard. He worked for Silas Doyle out at the Double D he kept to himself, paid his debts, and had never once, in all the weeks the Reverend had noticed him standing there, come through the church doors. "Do you suppose he means to come in one day?" Annie had asked, more curious than she cared to admit. "I suppose the Lord will bring him in when the Lord sees fit," her father had answered, in the manner of a man who had learned long ago not to rush what could not be rushed. "In the meantime, it is not our place to drag a man over his own threshold." And so it went, week after week, month after month. Harlan Shepard came and stood beneath the oak tree, and Annie Carter played the hymns a little more carefully, a little more clearly, though she told herself it was simply pride in her craft and nothing more. The seasons turned. Summer brought dust and heat and long evenings when the whole congregation spilled out onto the churchyard grass after the service to visit and gossip, and Harlan would linger at the edge of those gatherings too, close enough to nod at the Reverend, close enough to accept a glass of lemonade from one of the church women when it was offered, but never close enough to be drawn into the heart of the crowd. Winter brought snow that dusted the oak tree white and turned his breath to fog as he stood there, and more than once Annie noticed him without his coat buttoned properly, as though he had left in too great a hurry to dress for the cold, and something in her wanted to march out there and fasten it for him herself, though of course she never did. By the second year, the whole town had come to know him as a fixture of Sunday mornings, as much a part of the churchyard as the oak tree itself. The children took to waving at him on their way inside, and he would tip his hat to them, solemn and polite. The old women decided among themselves that he must be nursing some private grief, and speculated endlessly about its nature, though none of them dared ask him outright. The men of the town, who worked alongside him at branding time or saw him break horses at the county fair, spoke well of his skill and his steadiness, but admitted they knew little of the man beneath it. And Annie Carter, who saw him every week from her seat at the organ, found herself watching for him before the service began, feeling an odd hollow disappointment on the rare Sunday when weather or ranch work kept him away. It was in that second year that Wesley Prout began calling on her in earnest. Wesley was the only son of Millbrook Creek's banker, a well-dressed young man with soft hands and an easy way of talking that had won him considerable favor among the town's mothers, if not always among their daughters. He took Annie riding in his father's fine buggy, brought her ribbons from the dry goods store in Abilene, and made no secret of his intention to marry her before the year was out. Reverend Carter, who worried as any father might about his daughter's future in a hard country, looked on Wesley's attentions with open approval, for a banker's son could offer a woman a life of comfort that a schoolteacher's wages never would. Annie liked Wesley well enough. He was pleasant company, and he made her laugh with his stories of Kansas City, where he had spent 2 years reading law before returning home to work in his father's bank. But there was something in her that resisted the easy comfort of his courtship, some restlessness she could not name, and more than once, walking home from a buggy ride with Wesley's polite conversation still ringing in her ears, she found her eyes drifting toward the Double D road, wondering if Harlan Shepard was riding home from town at that same hour, and whether he ever thought of her at all. The 3rd year came, and with it, a change in Harlan that only Annie seemed to notice. He began arriving a few minutes earlier each Sunday, as though reluctant to miss even the opening notes of the first hymn. He took to bringing small things and leaving them where the church women would find them: a bundle of wildflowers on the porch rail in June, a basket of late apples in September, never with a note, never with his name attached, but Annie always knew somehow that they had come from him. She began to save him a hymn sheet from the extra pile, folding it carefully and setting it on the fence post where he stood, and though he never took it while anyone was watching, by the next Sunday it would always be gone. It was a strange courtship, if it could even be called that, conducted entirely at a distance of 30 yards and through the medium of hymn sheets and wildflowers, but it was a courtship all the same, and both of them in their private hearts knew it. Then came the picnic that changed everything. Each spring, when the last of the frost had gone out of the ground and the prairie grass had greened enough to promise a good season, the congregation of Millbrook Creek held its annual church social on the flat ground beside Miller's Creek, a mile outside town. It was the one Sunday of the year when services were held outdoors, a simple sermon delivered from the back of a wagon, followed by an afternoon of food and games and fellowship that drew nearly every family for 20 miles around. Harlan Shepard had never attended in the 3 years he had lived near Millbrook Creek, always finding some excuse of ranch work to keep him away. But that year, Silas Doyle himself insisted the hands come along and bring the ranch's horses to help with the wagon rides and races the children so loved. And Harlan, unable to refuse his employer without explanation, found himself standing at the edge of Miller's Creek on a bright May morning, closer to Annie Carter and her father's congregation than he had ever been in 3 years of Sundays. The morning went pleasantly enough. Harlan kept to the horses, helping the younger hands hitch teams for the wagon rides, speaking little, watching from beneath his hat brim as Annie moved through the crowd greeting families, laughing with the children, her yellow calico dress bright against the green grass. He told himself he would simply do his work and leave before the trouble of conversation could find him, but the day had other plans. It happened in the early afternoon, when the Reverend had organized a wagon race for the older children, a harmless bit of fun meant to let them drive a gentle team of matched grays around a marked course, while their parents cheered from the creek bank. Annie had volunteered to ride along in the wagon bed with the younger children who wanted to watch up close. 6 of them crowded in behind the driver's seat, laughing and calling out encouragement, as 12-year-old Tommy Hale took up the reins with the pride of a boy given his first real responsibility. No one could say afterward exactly what spooked the team. Some said it was a rattlesnake in the tall grass near the creek bend. Others swore a hawk had dropped low over the horses' heads and startled them. Whatever the cause, the gentle grays that had walked so calmly all morning suddenly threw their heads and bolted, and Tommy Hale, for all his pride, was no match for 2 frightened horses at a dead run with a wagon full of children rattling behind them. The wagon careened toward the creek bank, toward the deep water where the current ran fast around the bend, and the screaming of the children rose above the shouts of the men running uselessly after them on foot. Harlan Shepard was 40 yards away, saddling a horse he had been about to lead back to the picket line, and he did not think. He swung up bareback, no time for a saddle, No time for anything but the raw instinct that had once made him the best rough rider on 3 ranches, and drove his heels into the horse's flanks. He caught the runaway team at the very edge of the creek bank, close enough that the front wheels of the wagon had already begun to tilt over the eroded lip of earth above the water. He threw himself from his horse onto the back of the nearest gray, hauling on its bridle with every ounce of strength in his arms, dragging its head around hard enough that the terrified animal's momentum swung sideways instead of straight into the water. The wagon tipped, threw 2 of the smaller children clear into the grass with nothing worse than scrapes and screaming, and came to a grinding, shuddering halt with its back wheels hanging over open air above the creek. Annie had been thrown against the wagon's side rail, her arm twisted beneath her, and it was Harlan who reached her first, sliding down from the trembling gray horse and vaulting into the wagon bed, to gather the last of the frightened children into his arms and hand them down to the men who had finally caught up, breathless and pale. When at last the wagon was empty of children, he turned to Annie herself, who sat clutching her arm, her face white with pain and shock, her carefully pinned hair come loose and falling around her shoulders. "Are you hurt bad?" he asked, and it was the first time in 3 years that Annie Carter had heard Harlan Shepard's voice directed at her alone. It was low and rough, roughened further by the fear still coursing through him, but there was a gentleness in it too, the same gentleness she had heard him use with the terrified horse only moments before. "My arm," she managed. "I think it may be broken." He did not ask permission before he lifted her from the wagon bed, careful as a man handling something he feared might shatter, and carried her to the shade of a cottonwood tree where her father came running, his face gray with fright, and half the congregation crowded close behind him. Harlan set her down as gently as he could manage, and when Reverend Carter reached for his daughter, Harlan stepped back, suddenly aware of every eye upon him, aware of how close he had come, after 3 years of careful distance, to being seen. "Mr. Shepard." Reverend Carter's voice stopped him before he could retreat further. The old preacher's eyes were wet, his hand still shaking as he examined his daughter's arm. "I do not have words enough to thank you." "Wasn't nothing any man wouldn't have done," Harlan said, though everyone present knew that was not entirely true, for the men who had chased the wagon on foot had none of them come close to catching it. Annie, cradling her injured arm against her chest, looked up at him properly for the first time in 3 years, close enough now to see the color of his eyes, a pale gray blue like a winter sky, and the fine lines at their corners that spoke of a man who had spent a great deal of his life squinting into hard sun and harder memories. "Thank you," she said simply, and something passed between them in that moment that neither of them could have named, but both of them felt, a recognition perhaps of 2 people who had been circling each other at a careful distance for far longer than either had admitted. The town doctor, summoned from Millbrook Creek within the hour, confirmed that Annie's arm was indeed broken, a clean fracture of the forearm that would require a splint and several weeks of careful rest, but nothing that would not heal well with time. Harlan Shepard, in the chaos of the rescue, had wrenched his own shoulder badly enough that Silas Doyle insisted he see the doctor as well, and it was in the waiting room of Dr. Elias Fenwick's small clinic on the main street of Millbrook Creek that Annie Carter and Harlan Shepard had their first real conversation. 2 people finally close enough, after 3 years, to speak plainly to one another. "You've been coming to church for 3 years," Annie said, breaking the silence between them as they waited for the doctor to finish setting the splint on her arm. "Standing outside, I mean. I've watched you from the organ every Sunday." Harlan's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might simply refuse to answer, might retreat back into the careful silence he had maintained for so long. But something about the day, about the fear that had gripped him when he saw the wagon tipping toward the water, about the strange loosening a brush with real danger can bring to a man's guarded heart, made him speak instead. "I had a family once," he said quietly. a wife, a little girl. Fever took them both while I was away driving cattle, back in Missouri, more years ago now than I like to count. They were buried before I even got word. I never went back into a church after that. Couldn't make myself do it. But I heard you singing that first Sunday I came through Millbrook Creek, and I don't know how to explain it except to say it sounded like something I'd lost, and I couldn't make myself walk away from it either. So I just stood there, kept standing there, I suppose, longer than any reasonable man should. Annie was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the weight of what he had told her, understanding at last the sorrow she had always sensed beneath his silence. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I had no idea. Wasn't looking to be known," he said, "but I reckon after today that's harder to manage." She almost smiled at that despite the ache in her arm. "I suppose it is." They talked a while longer of small things mostly. The weather, the horses, the ranch, until Dr. Fenwick called Harlan in to see to his shoulder, and Annie was left alone with her thoughts, turning over everything he had told her, feeling for the first time that the quiet stranger who had haunted the edge of her Sundays for 3 years had become, in the space of a single afternoon, someone entirely different, someone real and wounded and worth knowing. In the weeks that followed, as Annie's arm healed in its splint and the town of Millbrook Creek buzzed with talk of the wagon rescue, Harlan Shepard found himself, almost without deciding to, calling at the Carter house with increasing frequency. He came first with a genuine excuse, bringing a length of good ash wood he had cut and shaped into a proper cane to help Annie manage her chores while her arm mended, and stayed only long enough to hand it over and touch his hat before retreating. But Reverend Carter, grateful beyond measure for his daughter's rescue and curious about the man who had performed it, invited him to stay for coffee, and Harlan, unable to think of a polite reason to refuse, found himself sitting at the Carter kitchen table for the better part of an hour, answering the Reverend's careful questions about his work at the Double D, and offering, in return, more of himself than he had offered anyone in years. He came again the following week, this time with no excuse at all beyond a simple knock at the door, and an offer to mend the loose porch step he had noticed on his previous visit, and Annie, who had been watching for him without quite admitting it to herself, met him at the door with a warmth in her expression that made his chest ache in a way he had almost forgotten a person could feel. "You didn't need to come all this way to fix a step, Mr. Shepard," she said, though she made no move to send him away. "Wasn't much trouble," he said, "and you may as well call me Harlan, seeing as we've known each other 3 years in a manner of speaking." She laughed at that, a bright sound that seemed to surprise them both. "Then you must call me Annie." From that day, something between them shifted decisively from the careful distance of the churchyard fence to something warmer, though still cautious on both sides. Harlan took to walking Annie home from the schoolhouse on the afternoons his work allowed, the two of them talking easily now of books and horses and the particular loneliness of the prairie winters. And Annie found herself looking forward to those walks with an eagerness that unsettled her when she examined it too closely, for she had never felt anything like it in all her polite, pleasant hours spent with Wesley Prout. Wesley, for his part, was not blind to the change. He noticed the way Annie's attention had begun to wander during their buggy rides, the way she spoke of the Double D ranch hand with a fondness she had never shown for anyone else, and his easy charm curdled quickly into wounded pride. He complained to his father, who complained in turn to Reverend Carter, suggesting delicately that a rough ranch hand of uncertain past was hardly a suitable companion for a preacher's daughter, particularly one whose family history, as far as anyone in Millbrook Creek could determine, remained entirely unknown. Reverend Carter, who had grown genuinely fond of Harlan Shepard in the weeks since the wagon accident, resisted these suggestions at first, but a father's worry is a persistent thing, and when Wesley Prout began to spread quieter rumors around town, rumors that Harlan had killed men during the war and after, that his silence hid something darker than simple grief, the Reverend's resolve began to waver. It did not help that these rumors carried a grain of uncomfortable truth, for Harlan had indeed served as a cavalry scout in the war's final year, had indeed fought men, and on more than one occasion killed them, though always in the chaos of battle and never with anything resembling the cold malice Wesley's whispers implied. The trouble came to a head on a warm evening in late June, when Reverend Carter asked Harlan to stay after one of his now regular visits and spoke to him plainly, man to man, in the small study at the back of the parsonage. "I have heard things about your past, Mr. Shepard," the Reverend said, his kind face troubled. "Talk of violence, of a man who has killed before and may kill again if crossed. I will not pretend these things do not concern me, given how deeply my daughter's affections seem to have turned toward you." Harlan sat very still, his hat turning slowly in his hands, the old familiar shame rising in his throat. "I served in the war, Reverend. I won't deny I've killed men, though never for pleasure and never for anything but survival, mine or another's. I'm not proud of it, but I won't lie about it either, not to you and not to Annie. And the rest," the Reverend pressed, "the talk that you have no family, no history that anyone in this town can verify. A man cannot simply appear from nowhere and expect to be trusted with a father's only daughter." It was then that Harlan told the Reverend what he had told no one else in Millbrook Creek save Annie herself, the story of Sarah and me, of the fever, of the funeral he had missed, of the 9 wandering years that had brought him at last to this town, and to this church he could not bring himself to enter. He spoke haltingly, the words coming hard after so many years of silence, but he did not stop until the whole of it was told, and when he finished, Reverend Carter sat for a long moment with his eyes closed, his hands folded as though in prayer. "I am sorry for your loss, Mr. Shepard," the Reverend said finally. "Truly sorry, a grief like that would break lesser men entirely, but I must ask you plainly, for my daughter's sake if not your own. Do you intend to spend the rest of your days standing outside my church, or is there some hope that a man so wounded might yet find his way back inside?" Harlan had no answer for that, not then, and the Reverend, seeing the struggle in his face, did not press him further. But the seed of the question had been planted, and it would not let Harlan rest easy in the weeks that followed, even as his courtship with Annie deepened, and the two of them grew closer with every passing Sunday that he stood, still, at the churchyard fence, and every afternoon that he walked her home from the schoolhouse with her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. Wesley Prout, humiliated by Annie's evident preference and by his father's grumbling disappointment, grew increasingly bitter as that summer wore on. He took to drinking more than was his habit at the Millbrook Creek saloon, and it was there, in July, that he fell into conversation with a stranger passing through town, a lean, hard-eyed man named Tate Dawson, who claimed to be looking for honest ranch work but whose careful questions about the town's bank, its cattle buyers, and the timing of the upcoming summer cattle payment suggested rather less honest intentions. Wesley, nursing his wounded pride and his whiskey in equal measure, let slip more than he should have about the town's affairs, about the bank's vault, and the day each month when Silas Doyle and the other ranchers brought their cattle proceeds in for deposit, a day that fell, as it happened, on the second Sunday of August, when the whole town would be gathered at church, and the bank would sit unguarded and unwatched. Tate Dawson thanked Wesley for his company, bought him another round, and left Millbrook Creek 2 days later, though not for good. He returned in early August with 4 other men, all of them known, though not to the good people of Millbrook Creek, as the remnants of a gang that had robbed banks and railroad payrolls across 3 territories over the past several years, always careful, always quick, and always gone before any posse could be raised to chase them. Harlan Shepard, riding fence along the northern edge of the Double D Range on the first Saturday of August, came across the tracks of 5 horses moving with unusual purpose toward town, and something in the pattern of it, the careful spacing, the deliberate avoidance of the main road, set his old scout's instincts on edge. He followed the tracks far enough to confirm his suspicion that the riders had circled wide around Millbrook Creek and made camp in a stand of cottonwoods along the creek bottom 2 miles east, close enough to watch the town but far enough to avoid notice, and he rode back to the Double D at a hard gallop to raise the alarm. Silas Doyle, once he understood what Harlan suspected, wasted no time sending riders to warn the town marshal, a capable but aging man named Otis Reed, who had kept the peace in Millbrook Creek for a dozen years without ever facing anything more dangerous than the occasional drunk cowhand. Marshal Reed, upon hearing Harlan's account of the tracks and the stranger's careful camp, agreed that the timing pointed toward the bank and toward Sunday, when the town's attention would be fixed on worship and the bank vault would sit behind nothing more than its usual lock. "We could close the bank Sunday," the marshal suggested. "Move the cattle money elsewhere." "They'll know something's wrong the moment they see it," Harlan said. "Men like this don't ride 200 miles on a guess." Somebody talked, and they'll have eyes on the town before Sunday to make sure their information holds. If we spook them into changing their plans sudden, no telling what they'll do instead, maybe hit the church full of folks instead of an empty bank. It was a grim thought but a reasonable one, and after considerable debate among the marshal, Silas Doyle, and several of the town's leading men, a plan was settled upon. The bank's actual cash would be quietly moved to a false vault the night before, replaced with only enough to make the theft look successful. And armed men, Harlan Shepard chief among them given his war experience, would position themselves at careful vantage points around the bank and the church both, ready to move the moment the outlaws showed themselves. Annie Carter, when she learned of the plan from her father, who insisted on being told everything given that the danger would unfold around his own church, was seized with a fear she had never known before, sharper and more consuming than anything she had felt watching the runaway wagon tip toward the creek. It was one thing to see a man risk himself against a frightened horse. It was another entirely to know he meant to stand against armed outlaws, and she went to him the night before, walking the 3 miles to the Double D alone in the dark despite her father's objections, because she could not bear the thought of the coming Sunday without telling him what weighed on her heart. She found him at the corral, checking the tack on the horse he meant to ride the next morning, and when he saw her coming across the yard in the moonlight, alone and out of breath from the walk, his first reaction was alarm. "Annie, what in the world are you doing out here at this hour? It isn't safe with those men camped so close." "I couldn't stay away," she said, coming to a stop before him, her breath still quick from the walking. "Not tonight, not knowing what tomorrow might bring." He set down the bridle he had been mending and looked at her for a long moment, the moonlight catching the worry plain on both their faces. "I've done this kind of thing before, Annie, during the war. I know how to keep my head. That isn't what frightens me," she said, and her voice trembled despite her effort to hold it steady. "What frightens me is that I have spent 3 years watching you stand outside that church, wondering what kept you there, wondering if I would ever know the man behind all that quiet. And now that I know you, now that I have finally, truly noticed you, Harlan Shepard, I cannot bear the thought of losing you before I have had the chance to tell you what you have come to mean to me." Harlan reached out and took her hands in his, rough and calloused against her smaller ones, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the whole of the prairie night settling quiet around them, the horses shifting softly in the corral, the stars wheeling overhead in that vast Kansas sky that had witnessed so much sorrow and so much hope in equal measure across the years. "I have loved you since the first Sunday I heard you sing," Harlan said finally, the words coming easier than he had expected, 3 years of careful silence finally breaking open. "I told myself I had no right to love anybody again, not after what happened to Sarah and me, not with the life I've led and the things I've done. But I have stood outside that church every single Sunday for 3 years, Annie Carter, because some part of me could not stay away from you, even when I believed I had no business hoping for anything more than the sound of your voice through an open window. Tomorrow, I mean to make certain nothing happens to you or your father or anyone else in this town. And when it is done, when it is finally, truly done, I intend to ask you properly to be my wife, if you will have a man as broken as I am." Annie's eyes filled with tears, though she smiled through them, standing on her toes to press her forehead against his in the darkness. "I will have you, Harlan Shepard, broken pieces and all. I have been waiting 3 years to hear you say so, even if I did not know that was what I was waiting for." He kissed her then, gently, for the first time, beneath the wide Kansas stars, and though the coming day carried real danger, in that moment both of them felt something settle into place that had been missing for far too long in each of their lives. Sunday morning came clear and hot, the kind of relentless August day that pressed the whole prairie flat beneath a white sky. The congregation gathered at the church as always, though Marshal Reed and several deputized townsmen had positioned themselves at careful intervals along the main street, rifles kept out of sight but close at hand, and Harlan Shepard sat mounted on a fast horse in the alley behind the bank, watching the road east for any sign of Tate Dawson's men. They came just before noon, 5 riders moving at an easy trot down the main street as though they belonged there, dismounting outside the bank with the casual confidence of men who believed their information sound and their success assured. Tate Dawson himself went to the door first, found it unlocked as expected, and led his men inside toward the vault that held, unbeknownst to them, only a fraction of the money they had come to steal. It was Harlan who moved first, riding around from the alley to block the horses tied outside the bank, cutting off the outlaws' easiest line of retreat, and it was his shout, sharp and commanding in the manner of a man who had once given orders under fire, that brought Marshal Reed and the deputized townsmen converging on the bank from 3 directions at once. The fight that followed was brief but sharp, the crack of pistol fire echoing down the quiet Sunday street and sending the last stragglers of the congregation scrambling for cover behind wagons and porch rails. Tate Dawson, realizing too late that he had ridden into a trap, tried to fight his way clear, and it was in the chaos of that attempt that Harlan Shepard, dismounted now and using an overturned water trough for cover, took a bullet through the meat of his upper arm even as he returned fire and put Dawson himself down with a wound to the leg that ended the outlaws fighting for good. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader fallen and the odds turned decisively against them, surrendered within minutes, and Marshal Reed, though shaken by the closest thing to real violence Millbrook Creek had seen in years, managed the arrests with steady hands and no further bloodshed. The whole affair, from the first shout to the final surrender, had taken less than 10 minutes, though it would be spoken of in Millbrook Creek for years afterward as the day the town very nearly lost its bank, and very nearly lost the quiet ranch hand who had, by then, become something of a fixture in its collective affection. Annie had been among those who scrambled for cover when the shooting began, her father pulling her behind the heavy stone base of the church steps, and it was there she waited through the longest 10 minutes of her life, praying with a fervency she had never before brought to any Sunday service, until the shooting stopped and word came running down the street that the outlaws were taken and the town was safe. She found Harlan sitting on the boardwalk outside the bank, his shirt sleeve soaked through with blood, Dr. Fenwick already kneeling beside him to examine the wound, and she pushed through the gathering crowd without any thought for decorum, dropping to her knees beside him and taking his good hand in both of hers. "You are going to be the death of me, Harlan Shepard," she said, half laughing, half sobbing, "getting yourself shot the very day after you finally told me you loved me." "Wasn't my plan," he managed, wincing as the doctor probed the wound, though a faint smile touched his mouth despite the pain. "Bullet went clean through. Doc says I'll mend just fine given a few weeks." Dr. Fenwick, tying off a temporary bandage, confirmed as much, pronouncing the wound serious but not life-threatening, the bullet having passed through the muscle of the arm without touching bone or artery. Harlan would need rest and careful attention for a month or more, but he would keep the arm, and he would keep his life. And for Annie Carter, kneeling in the dust of the Millbrook Creek street with his blood-streaked hand held tight in her own, nothing else in the world mattered nearly so much as that single fact. Wesley Prout, who had watched the whole affair unfold from the safety of his father's bank window, came forward that afternoon, his face gray with shame, and confessed to Marshall Reed and to Reverend Carter both that he had unwittingly given Tate Dawson the information that had nearly cost the town so dearly, drunk and bitter and careless with his words on a night he now bitterly regretted. He offered to leave Millbrook Creek entirely rather than face the consequences of his loose tongue, but Reverend Carter, ever inclined toward mercy, counseled instead that Wesley make what amends he could, working alongside the townsmen to repair the bank's damaged door and contributing generously from his own savings to the fund raised for Harlan's care during his recovery. Wesley took the counsel to heart, and though he never did win back Annie's affections, nor did he particularly wish to any longer, he settled in time into a quieter, more humble version of himself, eventually marrying a rancher's daughter from the neighboring county and building a life that, while less dramatic than he might once have imagined, brought him a contentment his earlier pride had never allowed. Harlan Shepard's recovery took place at the Carter house itself, for Reverend Carter would not hear of the man who had saved both his daughter and his town's bank convalescing alone in a bunkhouse 3 miles distant, and so a bed was made up in the small back room of the parsonage, and Annie, with her father's blessing and the help of the church women who brought soup and bread and gossip in equal measure, nursed Harlan through the worst of his fever and the slow, aching healing of his wounded arm. It was during those weeks of recovery, the two of them sitting together on the parsonage porch in the cooling evenings of late August as his strength slowly returned, that Harlan finally told Annie the whole of his story, every detail he had held back even in the churchyard confession that had first opened his heart to her. He told her of Sarah's laugh, of the particular way she had of humming while she kneaded bread dough. He told her of Me's small hands, of the way she had called him Papa Bear, because he used to growl and chase her around their little house in play. He told her of the letter that had reached him too late, of the long ride home to find a fresh grave instead of a living family, of the 9 years he had spent wandering half the West trying to outrun a grief that had, in the end, simply followed him every mile. "I used to think," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer troubled to hide, "that if I never went back into a church, I could keep some part of myself apart from all that sorrow. Like the sorrow could only reach me through those doors, and if I stayed outside, I could hold it off a little longer. But standing outside your church all these years, Annie, I came to understand something different. I understood that I wasn't keeping the sorrow out. I was keeping myself out, keeping myself from everything a church is supposed to offer a person, comfort and forgiveness, and the chance to start again." Annie took his good hand in hers, the evening light gold and soft across the porch. "Sarah and me would not want you to spend the rest of your life standing outside in the cold, Harlan. Grief like yours does not mean you have to live only half a life forever. I think if you will let yourself, you might find there is room in your heart both to remember them and to love again, fully, without one taking anything away from the other. I know that now," he said quietly. "I think I have known it for some time, if I am honest, and simply lacked the courage to act on it. But I mean to act on it now, Annie Carter, as soon as this arm of mine is fit to stand at an altar without falling over." She laughed at that, bright and warm in the evening air, and leaned her head against his good shoulder, and they sat together in comfortable silence as the first stars came out over Millbrook Creek, both of them feeling, for the first time in a very long while, that the future stretching ahead of them held far more promise than sorrow. The second Sunday of September, 6 weeks after the failed bank robbery, and with his wounded arm healed enough to move freely if not yet fully strong, Harlan Shepard walked to the church at Millbrook Creek as he had every Sunday for 3 years. But that morning, when the bell rang out over the rooftops calling the faithful to worship, he did not stop at the fence beneath the old bur oak tree. He walked past it, up the church steps, and through the doors he had avoided for over a decade, into the cool, dim interior filled with the murmur of the gathering congregation and the particular hush of morning light through simple glass windows. The church fell quiet as he entered, every head turning to watch the man who had waited outside for so long finally cross the threshold, and Annie Carter, seated at the organ with her hands stilled on the keys, felt her heart swell so full she thought it might burst clean through her chest. Reverend Carter, standing at the pulpit, met Harlan's eyes across the length of the sanctuary and gave a small, knowing nod, as though to say the moment had been a long time coming and was all the sweeter for the wait. Harlan walked down the center aisle, past the pews filled with families who had watched him stand outside for 3 years without ever quite understanding why, and stopped before the altar where Reverend Carter stood waiting. He turned then to look at Annie, still seated at her organ, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and in a voice that carried clear through the hushed sanctuary, he spoke the words he had been carrying in his heart since that moonlit night at the corral. "Annie Carter, I have stood outside this church every Sunday for 3 years, telling myself I had no right to what was inside it. I was wrong. There is nothing in this world I want more than to stand here, in this church, in front of your father and everyone who has watched us both these long years, and ask you properly to be my wife. I love you. I have loved you since the first Sunday I heard you sing, and I mean to spend whatever years the Lord grants me making certain you never doubt it." The congregation, many of them women who had spent 3 years speculating over the sorrow of the quiet man at the fence, broke into a soft murmur of delighted surprise, and Annie rose from her organ bench, crossed the sanctuary floor with her heart in her throat, and took both of Harlan's hands in hers before the whole gathered church. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at once. "Yes, Harlan Shepard, 1,000 times yes. I have been waiting 3 years to notice you properly, and I do not intend to waste another single day." Reverend Carter, his own eyes bright with tears he made no effort to hide, stepped forward and joined their hands together with his own, blessing them there before the altar while the congregation rose to its feet in spontaneous applause, and even Wesley Prout, seated near the back with his new sweetheart from the neighboring county, found himself clapping along with genuine warmth, all old bitterness long since burned away. They were married 3 weeks later, on a bright October Saturday when the cottonwoods along Miller's Creek had turned gold, and the whole prairie seemed to glow with the particular richness of a Kansas autumn. The church was filled beyond its capacity, every family in Millbrook Creek and half the ranches within 20 miles turning out to see the wedding of the schoolteacher and the quiet ranch hand who had waited so long and so faithfully for his chance. Silas Doyle gave Harlan the week off with full pay and a fine new saddle as a wedding gift, declaring that any man who could gentle wild horses and fight off outlaws with equal skill deserved at least that much consideration. The church women outdid themselves with a wedding feast spread across tables set up in the churchyard, and Dr. Fenwick, who had tended Harlan's wound so carefully through the summer, pronounced the groom fully recovered and fit for whatever adventures married life might bring. Annie wore a dress of pale blue calico, simple but lovingly made by her own hands over the preceding weeks, and Harlan stood at the altar in a new dark suit purchased with his savings from the Double D, his wounded arm fully healed now save for a thin scar that Annie would trace with gentle fingers on quiet evenings for years to come, a reminder of the day their love had been tested and had held firm. Reverend Carter performed the ceremony himself, his voice thick with the particular joy of a father giving away a beloved daughter to a man he had come, in the end, to love as a son. "Do you, Harlan Shepard," the Reverend asked, "take this woman to be your lawful wife, to love and cherish in sickness and in health for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Harlan said, his voice steady and sure, and gladly, having waited 3 years to earn the right to say so. "Do you, Annie Carter, take this man to be your lawful husband, to love and cherish, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Annie said, smiling through tears of pure joy, "and I would have said so a good deal sooner if only he had asked." The congregation laughed warmly at that, and when Reverend Carter pronounced them man and wife, the church bells rang out over Millbrook Creek in celebration, the same bells that had called Harlan to stand outside for 3 lonely years now ringing in triumph for the day he had finally, fully come home. Silas Doyle gave Harlan a plot of land bordering the Double D as a wedding gift, 40 acres of good grazing ground along the creek bottom that he had been saving for exactly such an occasion, having grown fond enough of his quiet, steady hand over the years to want to see him settled and prospering. Harlan and Annie built their first home there through that autumn and into the following spring, a simple but sturdy house of native limestone and good timber, with a wide porch facing east to catch the morning sun, and a small fenced garden where Annie grew vegetables and flowers with the same careful devotion she had once brought to her hymns. Annie continued teaching at the Millbrook Creek schoolhouse through that first year of marriage, and Harlan continued his work for Silas Doyle while slowly building his own small herd on their new land, the two of them settling into the particular rhythm of frontier married life, hard work balanced against evenings spent together on the porch watching the sun set over the prairie, talking of everything and nothing. The comfortable, easy talk of two people who had waited a long while to find each other, and did not intend to waste the time they had been given. Their first child, a son, was born in the summer of 1882, a sturdy, dark-haired boy they named Josiah after Annie's father, and Reverend Carter wept openly with joy when he held his first grandchild, declaring that the Lord had a fine sense of timing indeed, bringing such happiness to a family that had known its share of waiting and sorrow. 2 years later came a daughter, whom they named Sarah Me, honoring both the wife and daughter Harlan had lost so many years before, a gesture that brought tears to Harlan's eyes when Annie first suggested it, and one that he would say, in the years to come, had healed something in his heart that he had never fully expected could mend. "I used to think keeping their memory meant keeping myself apart from everything else," he told Annie, holding their infant daughter in his arms on the porch of their limestone house one quiet evening not long after her birth. "But I understand now that isn't so. Loving you, loving these children, it doesn't take anything away from loving them. If anything, it feels like carrying them forward into something good, something they would have wanted for me if they could have seen how the years played out." Annie leaned against his shoulder, watching their daughter's small fingers curl around her father's calloused hand. "I think Sarah and me would be glad to know their memory lives on in a child who will grow up loved and cherished, in a house full of warmth instead of sorrow. That seems a fitting way to honor them, don't you think?" "I do," Harlan said softly. "I surely do." Life on their small ranch was not without its hardships, as life on the Kansas frontier rarely was. There were years of drought when the creek ran low, and the cattle had to be driven farther afield for water, and one hard winter in 1885, when a blizzard trapped them in the house for the better part of a week. The whole family huddled close around the hearth, while the wind howled outside, and Harlan told stories of his younger days to keep the children entertained, and their minds off the storm. There was the ordinary worry of raising children in a country still rough at its edges, teaching young Josiah to ride, and to shoot safely almost as soon as he could walk steady, teaching Sarah Me her letters at the same kitchen table where Annie herself had once done sums as a girl in the parsonage. But there was joy too, abundant and constant, woven through every season of their life together. Harlan never missed a Sunday service again after that October wedding, sitting now inside the church rather than outside it, his family filling the third pew from the front, the same pew, as it happened, where he had once sat as a very young man in a different church in a different state, with a different wife and a different daughter, a coincidence he noticed only once quietly, and chose to see as a kind of gentle grace rather than a painful echo. Reverend Carter lived to see 3 more grandchildren born to Harlan and Annie over the years that followed, a second son named Thomas in 1887, and twin daughters, Grace and Charity, in 1890. The parsonage and the Shepard ranch both ringing with the noise and laughter of a family grown large and happy. The old reverend, in his final years, took particular delight in telling anyone who would listen the story of the quiet cowboy who had waited 3 years outside his church for a woman's notice, always adding, with a twinkle in his eye, that patience of that particular kind was surely a virtue the Lord smiled upon most especially. Harlan Shepard's small herd grew steadily across those years into a modest but respectable ranching operation of his own, and by the time Josiah Shepard, their eldest son, was old enough to ride the range alongside his father, the Shepard name had become as well regarded in Millbrook Creek as any in the county, spoken of not for any lingering rumor of violence or mystery, but for honest work, quiet generosity, and a marriage that the whole town had watched unfold from careful distance to full, joyful union, and had come, in the telling and retelling over years of Sunday dinners and church socials, to regard as something of a local legend. Annie never did give up her music entirely, though she stepped back from the schoolhouse once her own children needed her closer attention, continuing instead to play the organ at the Millbrook Creek Church every Sunday for the whole of her life, her voice still rising clear and warm above the congregation, just as it had on that long-ago spring morning when a wandering ranch hand first stopped outside the fence and found himself unable to walk away. On the 30th anniversary of that first Sunday, Harlan had stood beneath the old bur oak tree, now grown taller and broader with the passing decades. The whole Shepard family gathered at the Millbrook Creek Church for a Sunday service that felt, to everyone present, like a kind of quiet celebration, though no announcement had been made and no special occasion marked on any calendar. Harlan, gray-haired now but still strong, sat in the third pew with Annie's hand held loosely in his own, their grown children scattered among the congregation with spouses and children of their own, Josiah now ranching alongside his father, Sarah married to a schoolteacher in the neighboring town, Thomas apprenticed to Dr. Fenwick's successor, and the twins, Grace and Charity, grown into young women admired throughout the county for their kindness and their fine singing voices, a gift they had inherited, everyone agreed, from their mother. After the service, as the congregation spilled out into the churchyard for the usual visiting and fellowship, Harlan walked with Annie to the old bur oak tree, its branches now spreading wide and shady over the fence where he had once stood so many Sundays in patient, hopeful silence. "Do you remember," Annie asked, resting her head against his shoulder as they stood beneath the tree together, "the first time you told me you had watched me since you first heard me sing?" "I remember every Sunday I stood here," Harlan said, his voice soft with the particular tenderness that 30 years of marriage had only deepened rather than worn away. "Every single one. I remember thinking I had no right to hope for anything more than the sound of your voice through that window. I was a fool to wait 3 whole years to find the courage to speak to you properly." "You were not a fool," Annie said, smiling up at him with the same warmth that had first caught his heart on that long-ago spring morning. "You were a man carrying a grief too heavy to set down all at once. It took the time it took, Harlan, and I would not trade a single Sunday of that waiting, because it brought us here to this life, to these children, to 30 years of a love I would not exchange for anything this world could offer." He kissed her then, gently, beneath the old oak tree where their story had first quietly begun, the churchyard around them filled with the laughter of grandchildren and the easy chatter of neighbors who had watched their courtship unfold across 3 patient years, and had never once doubted in the decades since that it had been worth every moment of the waiting. And so it was that Harlan Shepard, who had once stood outside a church door for 3 long years, grieving a family lost and afraid to hope for another, found at last not only the courage to walk through those doors, but a lifetime of love waiting for him on the other side. A wife who had noticed him long before either of them dared admit it. Children who filled his heart with a joy he had once believed forever beyond his reach. And a town that had watched the whole of it unfold, Sunday by patient Sunday. Until the quiet cowboy at the fence became, in the end, simply and completely, a beloved husband, father, and neighbor, forever remembered in Millbrook Creek as the man who waited outside the church every Sunday for 3 years, until at last, gloriously, she finally noticed.